Welcome to the summer series in Apologetics. I'm Dr. Dave Newton. Glad to have you here. Hey, it's 6:30, so please take your seats and silence your cell phones. I trust you had a relaxing and fun July 4th holiday long weekend. You know, my schedule has me out of town all this week, July 10th through the 14th, and so I'd like to apologia for not being here this evening in person. But last week I came in and Sam went ahead and recorded Session-5 so we can stay on track with tonight part 2 of our review of the Bible and the apologetics for it. So let's begin our study this evening. Again, our basis for apologetics is always Saul of Tarsus up on the Areopagus there, just south of just below the Acropolis in Athens, where he had a dialogue with the Stoics and Epicureans, many skeptics questioning him about the hope that was in him. And apologetics is that term apologia used in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. It's about having a verbal defense, a reasoned argument for the word regarding the expectation within you. And that's what we want you to have, is a good, reasoned, logical, well thought out explanation for the questions that come to you. So let's do a quick summary of session 4. Could the Bible actually be God's direct communication to mankind? We know this about it from last time. It's the most well-documented literary work ever. The origins are very clear, well-documented, sequential, extremely consistent, and very traceable. Number 2, the writers are real people in real history, real places, real events, and the track record is well-documented through very well-defined history. Number 3, we talked about inerrancy and infallibility. The debate still goes on, but that does not alter or affect the substantive content. We took a look at some passages side by side last time and saw that there might be differences in the wording because of copying, but there's nothing that changes the substantive content. So supposed discrepancies do not change the actual underlying narrative. And of course, these inconsistencies or these contradictions that people raise all the time all have very logical explanations. I'll give you a resource tonight you can look at to check out a bunch of these. But you want to be logical, rational, good commentary from among these multiple 40 different authors. And so there might be some differences with regard to citations or a direct quote. I did an example of that for you last time. Language, wording, different idioms and figures of speech. But in the end, there's good explanations for what many claim to be all these apparent errors in the scriptures. So what's our logical segue this evening, going from session 4 into session 5? Well, the last session introduced some key specifications about the Bible. We went through things like what is it, where does it come from, when was it written, how was that decided, and so forth. Tonight, in part 2, we want to continue with these topics. You know, what are the oldest copies? How many manuscripts exist? Is it accurate within the historical context? Were there eyewitnesses? We don't have time in 1 hour to get all the way into the apocryphal books, so I'm going to refer you to Bruce Metzger's book, An Introduction to the Apocrypha. It's a classic. You can get a copy online, and it's a really good read, give you a nice overview of why they were not included in the scriptures, even though the Catholic Church included them in their Bible. We'll talk tonight about Bible prophecy, some things on Bible codes, any motivation for the writers to lie, and then the challenges to many of these errors and so forth. Again, I'll point you to Dr. Sean Nelson's website. You can just Google 800 Bible errors and their resolutions. And it's a website you can check that he has a exhaustive list. And it's not that I agree with every one of those, but it's a really good starting place among, I mentioned I have a spreadsheet with about 450 of these errors and good explanations for those. A lot of overlap with Dr. Nelson's work. In terms of our books, this list is up from last time as well. These are great reads with regard to the veracity of the scriptures, so I encourage you to get the notes at newtonfio.com, and you can go ahead and find many of these online. A used copy, usually around $8 or $10 or something like that. So the ones that I really enjoyed, Steve Davis's The Debate About Bible Inerrancy versus Infallibility, back from my college days there, 1977. We also read F.F. Bruce, his classic work, The History of the English Bible. You'll really like that, very easy to read. And then also Bruce did the New Testament documents, Are They Reliable? and that's an old book from 1943. It was on the shelves of our library. Could check it out. I really enjoyed going through that as well. You'll really enjoy it. And the nice thing is, as I said, the publishers have done this update where Bruce, J.I. Packer, Phil Comfort, and Carl Henry have all combined into a really great resource from 2003, The Origin of the Bible, a really good read. So what are the oldest manuscripts out there? Here's a 1,000-year-old Hebrew Bible. This is from the 10th century A.D. It's on display in Washington, D.C. There's a beautiful facility called the Museum of the Bible. And this particular codex features the Masoretic text of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, so the full Torah. And when we say codex, remember that the term biblion in the Greek, which Latin turned into biblia, it was originally meant a scroll, and yet over time they stopped using scrolls and they started putting things into page format, which is what we call a codex. And so a codex is the page form where you flip pages separate from the scroll. So this is well over 1,000 years old and intact, all of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Here's some comparisons side by side of a Masoretic text from about 1000 AD, the Genesis scroll, which you can see there from about 900 AD, and then Isaiah's giant scroll from Qumran, which goes all the way back to 100 BC. And when you look at the comparisons and where the quotes come from with regard to the scriptures and so forth, a couple things you'll see is the notes in the top, bottom, and side margins with the Masoretic text. You can see those little footnote and special kind of secretarial inferences on vowels and so forth that they put in there. And then the Qumran scroll is really fascinating because when you look at these, just incredible consistency and overlap with exactly what we have today. No discrepancies. And also, as we think about old ones, here's the Codex Sinaiticus. This was found at the base of the traditional site for Mount Sinai at the St. Catherine Monastery back in the 1850s. And it's essentially a Greek Septuagint, and it dates to the middle of the 4th century A.D. And really fascinating. It's in codex form as well. It looks like a book. Also, as we think about old copies, in the Vatican, in Italy, if you've had a chance to go to Italy and go to the Vatican, you can't actually get in to see this particular copy from the archives, but the Codex Vaticanus dates to around 350, 340 AD, so the middle of the 4th century. And again, even as I look at my basic understanding of New Testament Greek, I can definitely read and recognize words as we go through. Notice there are no spaces between the letters. As you would just read it, you would go through and you would logically recognize where words begin and end. But we're talking about something that goes all the way back to the 4th century. This Nash papyrus, a guy bought this in an antiquity shop in 1902, had it tested and corroborated by many scholars over the next 2 decades. This dates to the 2nd century BC. So it's one thing to have something from the middle of the 4th century AD. This dates all the way back to the 2nd century BC. And really fascinating to take a look at the Hebrew writing there. One of the very oldest that we have from the New Testament, this dates to around 125 AD, they think. So the very beginning of the 2nd century. This is just a little bit past the time of John being an old man up in Ephesus. And this is just 75 years or so removed from the mid-50s AD when the original gospel was being penned by John. So we're just, 7 or 8 decades since his original manuscript. And this is at the Rylands P52, or papyrus number 52. It's at Manchester, England, is where it's kept. And it's only a couple of fragments, but as you go through and read in the Greek, you can immediately recognize that it's capturing a portion from John's Gospel. The Chester Beatty Library is in Dublin, Ireland. This is papyrus number 46. This dates to around 200 AD. This is a big section from 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 33 up to about chapter 12, verse 9. And again, as I look at this, very easy to recognize the Greek New Testament. We actually, in my Greek class, in my senior year of college with Dr. Killian, we had Elementary Greek 1 in the fall, Elementary Greek 2 in the spring, the New Testament version, and we actually translated this particular document. We didn't have it on a website or anything like that. There was no web at that time. We simply had copies of it that had been made on a just, regular parchment paper, and they were given to us, and it was one of the things we had to do as part of an assignment. And it was really fun to do that as you go through, and you can definitely recognize it overlaps and is perfectly lined up with what you'd see in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 up through verse 9 of chapter 12. The Dead Sea Scrolls, they were found in Qumran between 1947 and 1956. You have 900 manuscripts included, including every Old Testament book except Nehemiah and Esther. So think about that. Of the 37 Old Testament books that we look at there, 26, yeah. So as we go through and you see the 39 Old Testament books, you have 37 of them here. And this dates from 250 BC up to about 68 AD, prior to the fall of Jerusalem. And so really starts right after the Maccabean revolt in the middle of the 2nd century BC. The Essene community went down to Qumran. I was there last fall, and as you come south of Jerusalem and you're heading toward the Dead Sea, all of a sudden you come to this area. It looks just like Mars, and yet this is where the Essenes came. And about 150 BC, they were opposed to the Hasmonean rule that was taking place at that time, and so they went off into the desert and to walk around Qumran for several hours, to go up near the caves where these were found, to see how they lived in the different rooms, especially the irrigation and cistern system that they had for fresh water. Really amazing, but incredible finds when you think about the entire Old Testament is there, and except again for Nehemiah and Esther. And then as you think about, here's a really interesting scroll. This goes all the way back to the 7th century BC. Now think about how that's taking you back before the time of Daniel and before the time of the Babylonian exile and so forth, captivity. This is called the Ketef Hinnom, and it's nicknamed the Silver Scroll. It's actually on metal. It's been beaten into the metal as kind of using a tool to etch in and stamp, if you will, the scriptures in there. It's from the 7th century. It was found back in 1979, 1980. It's graphic etched letters in Hebrew, and the translation you can see on the right-hand side. The actual stamped silver is on the left. This is how they mapped it on the right, and then this is how they broke down the Hebrew that's in there, and it's from Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 to 26, and many of us know this salutation really well. May the Lord bless you, and may Yahweh keep you, cause his face to shine upon you, and give you peace. And so it's a wonderful, wonderful preserved document. Think about it, going all the way back to before the time of Daniel and the exile into Babylon. So how many manuscripts of the Bible exist today? Well, the New Testament is the number one ancient literature that we have, has over 5,800 Greek complete and partial manuscripts. So those can be either scrolls, some codices, or just fragments and sections of pages from the letters that were copied and distributed all throughout the Mediterranean basin, from Paul's letters and the Gospels and so forth, Peter's letters, James, Jude. We have 10,000 complete or partial manuscripts in Latin, and then we have another 9,300 in some other languages like Syriac and Aramaic and so forth. So together, you can look at the numbers there, about 25,000 manuscripts, and it's amazing to see similar manuscripts on the same passage from the New Testament, a gospel or an epistle, and then you lay them side by side, and as we looked at last week, you might find some slight differences in how they were copied, but the message does not change. The substantive content is consistent. In terms of the Old Testament, we have over 700 manuscripts are included in the Cairo Geniza synagogue. This was unearthed in 1890. In the wall there, they found this hiding place for all these documents, and there's several thousand, but 700 of these are from the Bible. Factor in for the Old Testament then the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we just looked at a moment ago. We're talking about over 950 Hebrew Bible manuscripts among what they found in Qumran, there in the caves, in those earthen jars. And then the Cairo Old Synagogue has over 10,000 Hebrew Bible manuscripts altogether. So it's really, really interesting to see the wealth of New Testament and Old Testament documents we have. Now let's compare that, if you would. I think last time we were here, one of the questions was asked by Mike, which was, hey, aren't there so many more manuscripts backing up the Bible versus some other supposedly very well-known and well-respected and embraced ancient works that are extra-biblical that have much less? And let me give you a couple of examples. Julius Caesar's classic work, The Gallic Wars. There's only 10 manuscripts remaining. The earliest comes from about 1,000 years after those events. So there's nothing even within 1,000 years, whereas many of these documents we have are all within 100 years, 150, 175 years, things like that. Natural History by Pliny the Younger. There's only 7 manuscripts left, and those are only 5 of those are just partials. And the earliest one is still 750 years after the events that he's commenting on. When you think about Plato, very popular in a philosophy course and so forth, there's only 13 manuscripts total left for everything related to Plato. And the earliest connection is 1,300 years distance from when Plato lived to the oldest manuscript we have. So that's, I mean, think about it, that's 1.5 millennia practically. 2 other works, so the Annals by Tacitus. It's only 20 manuscripts left, and there's 1,000 years between when he wrote and the copy that we still have. So for 1,000 years, nothing in between. And then the classic work by the Greek historian Herodotus. It's just simply called History. There's only 8 manuscripts and fragments left total, and there's about a 1,300-year gap between when Herodotus was writing and the oldest manuscript we have of that. So think about how those are embraced as being true, being well documented, being confirmed, and so forth. And the Bible has much more with regard to number of manuscripts and closer in right to the time when those events took place. The other question that comes up is it accurate within historical contexts? For instance, does Bible archaeology substantiate this history? And so I would just simply point you to, again, I use this comment a lot. Remember, the Bible is not written about some fantasy, fictional work of Middle Earth or Atlantis or Shangri-La. This is set in real history. Real nations, kingdoms, countries, kings and emperors, regions, rivers, oceans, politicians, and so forth. These are all able to be documented as in the context of the scriptures. Give you a couple examples. Egyptian history lines up very, very well there in the time of the 1500 BC, so about 1.5 millennia BC. You take a look at Egyptian history and overlap it with the Israelites being in Goshen in slavery, the rise up of Moses to ultimately then lead the people out, and great correlation with the Exodus accounts. Same with Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, and Cyrus. The history lines up very, very well with what Daniel has chronicled in his writing. The times of David and Solomon, you go back to about 1000 BC, and that history lines up very, very well with the writings in the Psalms, in Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Excellent, excellent works that provide a historic context for the time of those kings right after King Saul. And then, of course, the Roman Empire is really well documented, especially at the time of the beginning of that first century, the end of the last century BC. Lines up very well with the Gospels and the time of Jesus being in Judea. For instance, Caesar Augustus is mentioned in the scriptures, and he did reign from 27 BC to 14 AD. There in the narrative for the Christmas story for when Jesus was born. Herod the Great reigned from 37 BC until his death in January of 1 BC. And you can take a look in and see a lot of great documentation that supports that earlier death as opposed to January of 4 BC, which many things on the web will talk about. But it really lines up well with that eclipse that took place in Jerusalem, in Judea, in 1 BC. That fits very well. If you want some more detail on that, you can see that in my book, The Birth of Jesus on Yom Teruah. The other is Quirinius, who was the legate governor of the Syrian province from 4 BC to 12 AD. He's also in the narrative about Jesus' birth. Caesar Tiberius, he reigned right after Augustus from 14 AD to 37 AD. He was on the throne at the time when Jesus was crucified. And of course, Pontius Pilate for a long time, up until the 1960s. There was a lot of debate about, oh, there's no such man as Pontius Pilate. He never existed. But ultimately, they found in Caesarea Maritima, 1961, a stone block from inside the main amphitheater, and on it had inscriptions including the name of Pontius Pilate. And I was in Caesarea Maritima, and you get a chance to see that location where that block was found. The credibility of the gospel accounts comes into question quite a bit, and it's really important to take a look and see the basis for some of those questions and so forth. A great book that I can point you to is a book called Cold Case Christianity, and it's by J. Warner Wallace. And that book is written by Jim Wallace. He is a homicide detective who is featured on NBC TV's Dateline. And what you'll find is that he's a cold case forensics homicide detective. And he talks about the fact that whenever you're called in to do a case, what they call a cold case, it means that it's from the distant past. It has either limited or no direct forensic evidence still available, and only circumstantial evidence is available, and that the eyewitnesses typically are no longer alive or available to be questioned. And they'll bring him in and say, how can you help us solve this cold case? And he uses a template in his court testimony based on 4 simple questions that he always asks. Number 1, was the eyewitness really present when he or she was, saying what she said? Were they present there? Do they corroborate other evidence that we have? Are they accurate and consistent, or does the story change over time? And is there any bias? Do they have any motivation to be lying? And as he applies these same principles, which he does in doing cold case forensics, he finds that the accounts of the Gospels stand up very well to the same scrutiny that they use in these court cases for these homicide investigations. So you apply that to the Gospel writers, and as far as he's concerned, they become out very, very credible. Then the eyewitnesses to the events recorded. Let's think about that for a moment. You've got Moses was an eyewitness. Joshua was an eyewitness, both to Egyptian slavery, the Exodus, entering toward Canaan, spying out the land with Caleb, the Battle of Jericho, and so forth for Joshua. David and Solomon, of course, had very first-hand knowledge of Israel, Judah, Jerusalem, Psalms, and Proverbs. Matthew, John Bar Zebedee, and Peter Bar Jonah were all disciples of Jesus, one of the original 12 that were called, all eyewitnesses, with him from when he started his ministry in the fall of 29 AD, excuse me, up until his crucifixion in 32 AD, and then the resurrection and his ascension in May of 32 AD. So they were eyewitnesses of everything. Saul of Tarsus was an eyewitness at Stephen being stoned by the Sanhedrin with his full approval, and certainly his encounter with Christ on his way to Damascus qualifies him as an apostle. Luke was an eyewitness with Saul, Barnabas, Silas, Timothy, in understanding a lot of the Acts of the Apostles, yet he was a good friend of Peter's and so forth, and was able to talk to many of the eyewitnesses from the gospel period in writing his gospel. James, who was Jesus' half-brother, along with his other brother Jude, another half-brother of Jesus, they were eyewitnesses of Jesus in Nazareth for probably 25 plus years, born after Jesus. Portions of his ministry they were able to see. They also saw their brother resurrected, which changed them dramatically to the place where James ends up writing his epistle and Jude his, as very strong evidence for the veracity of Jesus having died on the cross and being raised as Messiah. When you think about eyewitnesses, I mentioned last time, I want to do a little more drill down on this. One of the first books I would always have you consider, a real favorite of mine, I mentioned last time there were over 15,000 biographies of Lincoln. And I have read 6 of those. I put them on our notes from last week. And my favorite of all of those is The Team of Rivals. This book is from Doris Kearns Goodwin. And interestingly, it came out in 2006. So she is not an eyewitness to anything about Lincoln. It was written 145 years after Lincoln's presidency. She was not there. But what she does is she draws upon some excellent letters, newspaper articles, legislative minutes, military records, other correspondences, and she pieces together from these original sources and people who were eyewitnesses, people who did know Lincoln, people who served in his cabinet, people who were in the legislature at the time he was president, people who were in the army at the time, and she puts together what has been basically stated as the definitive work on the life of Abraham Lincoln. Another example I'll give you, another favorite book of mine, Pulitzer Prize-winning author David McCullough, 2002, did his book, John Adams. This is written 225 years after our nation's founding. So he certainly was not an eyewitness, but like Doris Kearns Goodwin, he drew upon letters, articles, the legislative minutes of the Continental Congress, the correspondence going back and forth between Jefferson and Adams, the diaries that they had, shipping notes and so forth. And once again, everybody says this is the definitive work on the life of John Adams. And nobody was right there at the time writing down everything John did and trying to create a biography from an eyewitness account. Consider that Flavius Josephus, he lived from 37 to about 100 AD. He was an eyewitness to Titus Vespasian coming into Jerusalem and leveling the temple. And his network of people that he knew there in the first century were people that knew the disciples, the gospel writers. They knew Saul of Tarsus. They knew James, and they knew Jude. And in conversing with all these folks, he was able to pull together an incredible history of the Jews. And he is considered to be an excellent resource for understanding not only first century, but even Old Testament times of the Jews because of the oral tradition passed down through people that he knew in the Judeo communities there in the Mediterranean basin. So I'll give you another example. Ronald Reagan, there are over 500 biographies on his life. Many were eyewitnesses, maybe in his cabinet or in his administration. Many were not. Many were written in just the last 5 or 10 years. Again, piecing together stuff from newspaper articles and from public record and so forth. Over 4,500 biographies and different historical works have been written about the American Revolution. Very few of those have eyewitnesses involved. They're all written this side of the Revolution. Over 5,500 have been written about ancient Rome and about the Caesars and all the wars of Rome and so forth. And again, very few eyewitnesses. Virtually all of that material comes from people who knew somebody, and it was passed down, and various kinds of documented records and so forth. So then, what about Bible prophecy? Well, another great way as an apologetics response to is the Bible credible, is the Bible trustworthy, is the Bible worth reading and valuing as a historical document and so forth. Literally dozens of prophecies have been fulfilled. So you have a couple categories. First, you have prophecies from the Old Testament, just of things happening during that time in the Old Testament days and seeing them fulfilled. You also have prophecies pointing toward the advent of Messiah coming into the world, and those are remarkable. And then you have prophecies in the first century pointing out toward the future, and many of those, in fact, right from Jesus himself. We'll take a look at a couple of these this evening. So here's a couple. I'm just going to give you some of my favorites that I use off the top of my head. Ezekiel, writing back right around 597 BC, the beginning of that 6th century BC. In Ezekiel 26, he writes about Nebuchadnezzar is going to attack Tyre. He's going to build siege ramps on the huge walls going up the walls of Tyre. He mentions that many nations are going to come against Tyre. Tyre is going to be scraped flat, bare, just like a stone. The citizens will flee to an island offshore for safety, and that the building blocks of the city, the timbers, and the soil from that city being sieged is going to be thrown into the sea. And this is all prophesied, several hundred years before any of these events took place. Now, let's take a look. In 330 BC, almost 300 years later, Alexander the Great actually does take all of the debris, the soil, the timbers, the stones from the walls, and moves everything out into the Mediterranean Sea and just keeps dropping it like a landfill. And the small island that's off the coast, which was originally designed by the city architects as a place for the population to flee during a siege, they'd be safe over there. He built essentially a causeway going all the way out, a landfill that ultimately connected. And if you look at a satellite photo today, if you've never had a chance to go to the Middle East and visit Tyre, but you can take a look and you can see what it looked like in ancient days with the island off the coast. And today, there's this peninsula that sticks out, and that is all the debris from the original city being sieged, and that is still there today, and yet that was spoken of close to 300 years before it ever happened. It's an exact, precise prophecy. Jeremiah 50 and 51, there's a very specific description about the fall of Babylon, how it's going to happen. The rivers are going to dry up and so forth. The leading folks of Babylon and the leaders and the king and so forth and the princes will all be drinking and being drunk and so forth. Judah will be captive for exactly 70 years. Well, when you get to 539 BC, Cyrus captures the city exactly as it was prophesied. Everything about diverting the water out from inside the city so they could go in under the gate because there was no longer a river running through. The leadership was having a party that evening and so forth, and were pretty much caught unaware. And it's, again, exact and specific, and yet it's done, well over 300 years before the events happened. About 200 years before. Isaiah chapter 44 and chapter 45, written in around 720 BC, there's a letter to Cyrus written by name, calling out Cyrus by name and saying he is going to be God's instrument. And this is 150 years before Cyrus even existed. Daniel ends up, when Cyrus comes in at the conquest of Babylon, the old Daniel, who's now maybe in his 80s and so forth, he comes and meets the new conquering ruler, and he presents to him the scroll of Isaiah as documented by Josephus. And in that scroll, Cyrus opens it up and he reads this letter from Isaiah that specifically names Cyrus being used as the instrument of God. And again, an exact, precise prophecy. And I'll give you one more. In Luke chapter 21 and also in Matthew 24, Jesus is in 32 AD making a statement as he's there looking at the temple in Jerusalem, and he says, "Not one stone of the temple is going to be left on another." And everybody looks at that and says, what are you talking about? How could the temple ever be taken down and so forth so that not one stone is on another? And yet in just 38 years, Titus Vespasian comes in, flattens Jerusalem, the fire inside the temple begins, it begins to melt the gold gets into the seams and the mortar cracks of all the major stones. He orders that the Roman soldiers dismantle the temple to get to the gold. And the temple is, in fact, not one stone left upon another, exactly as Jesus had prophesied. And I've got dozens of these, a lot of great works in the references you can look at as well on this. But let me give you another area of Bible prophecy in this one area of anticipation of and speaking specifically about Messiah. This round here is about 20 or so, maybe 25 prophecies. And we'll just cover them real quickly here, but think about this. Genesis 49, Messiah is going to come from the tribe of Judah. Isaiah said, a virgin will conceive and give birth. Micah says Messiah will be born in Bethlehem of Ephrathah. Genesis 3 said it will be from the seed of a woman. Well, the seed normally comes from the man, but if it's a virgin birth, an interesting play on words there, very prophetic. Hosea 11 says that I will call my son out of Egypt. And of course, they did come out of Egypt after they had fled because of Herod. Isaiah 11 says he'll be called a Nazarene, the branch. Daniel 9, Messiah is going to come into Jerusalem exactly 173,880 days after the decree to Nehemiah to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, given to him by Artaxerxes Longimanus. I would encourage you to go to newtonfio.com and take a look at my Daniel study. Scroll down until you find the notes for Daniel chapter 9, and you'll see a full detailed drill down on all the specifics of that amazing prophecy about these 7 weeks of years, 62 weeks of years, and it points directly to when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on April 6th of 32 AD. Zechariah 9 says he'll come riding in on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Isaiah 53 says he'll be despised and rejected by men. Isaiah 40 says there'll be a prophet that's going to precede the Messiah. And we see then in John chapter 1, verse 23, John the Baptist fulfilling that, saying, I am the voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Zechariah 11 says he's going to be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, which is exactly what happened. Deuteronomy chapter 4 says, oh, cursed is the one who hangs upon a tree. And that's how Jesus becomes the curse of sin for us. Exodus 12, he's sacrificed as the lamb, fulfilling the Passover in its entirety. And Exodus 12 says, not a single bone will be broken of the Passover lamb, and certainly none was broken on him. Isaiah 50 said his beard will be ripped out of his skin on his face, and he'll be spit upon. And Isaiah 53 says he'll be scourged, and by his stripes, or these markings on his back, these scars that are opened up, we will be healed. Psalm 22, read that sometime. When you go home this evening or the next couple of days, open up Psalm chapter 22 and just read it. It's a first-hand, first-person singular account of what it is to be on the cross being crucified. And this is 900 years prior to crucifixion being invented by the Romans as their means for capital punishment. It talks about being scorned, about thirsting, about having your feet and your hands pierced and your side pierced, that they're going to cast lots for his clothing. And even when he says, it is finished, tetelestai, comes from there. As you think about Isaiah 53 again, he's going to be buried in a rich man's grave. And in Psalm 16, Messiah will not see decay. And he was raised on the third day before the body could go into any kind of physical decay. Isaiah 53 and 55 and Psalm 16 speak about him being resurrected from the dead. So here's a body of around 24, 25, 26 prophecies from among well over 220 that I have in my spreadsheets. These are all exact matches to what happened with Jesus. Now, either he would have to have his parents in on this conspiracy when he was a kid to have all this stuff happen, or he'd have to have his disciples all in on this ruse, and they'd have to constantly be thinking about how to do things in a way that would line up with prophecy. But in the end, the probability of one man fulfilling all of these in that window of time on our planet's history is less than 1 in 10 to the 37th power. And so you're talking about it's virtually impossible that somebody could just accidentally fulfill every one of these during his lifetime. Then comes the issue about the credibility of the scriptures, because a lot of people have pointed to what are called these Bible codes. There's lots and lots of different books out there. The one that I have is by Grant Jeffrey, The Mysterious Bible Codes. You can also read some great stuff published by Koinonia House that Chuck Missler has put out over the last couple decades regarding the Bible codes. There's 2 levels of these codes. One is called a macro code. It has to do with things like patterns of speech or names or places as being prophetic. And then there are what are called these microcodes that actually get right down to the letters in the sentences, in the lines of text. And the first is what is called in the microcodes equidistant letter sequences. That's a great term, right? Equidistance letter sequences, ELS. Really popularized in 1958 by Rabbi Wiesmandel. And today, most of these are now done with computer programs that can do keyword searches and so forth. But back then, they actually did a lot of the searching by hand, counted them through, and it even goes back several centuries earlier to many of the rabbis involved in writing in the Mishnah and the Talmud and so forth, who had already begun to recognize patterns in the actual microcodes of the letters and how things are arranged. The second is what is called the ancient practice of gematria. And this is more of a kind of a mystic form of alphabetic letters having numeric values, so that the scholars again went through and said, well, gee, if every letter has a numeric value, maybe there are all kinds of numeric codes throughout the Hebrew text. We're not going to spend any time on that, but you will find some very interesting things on the ELS, and we'll do one example this evening. Just before then, the Bible manuscripts, when people ask about, well, are Bible codes a realistic, logical way to think maybe the Scriptures has these? Well, they're written in continuous, non-spacing format of the letters, and they're meant to be read in one continuous line. There aren't chapters and verses like we have in our modern books. And so it actually lends itself to the idea that, yeah, you would actually probably count through and find things within there that could, in fact, point to some kinds of codes within that text. One example, Esther chapter 5, verse 4, the statement says, "Let the king and Haman come today." And in the Hebrew, you can see it there as it's written. The first letters for the 4 Hebrew words for "let the king and Haman come today" actually spell out Yahweh or Yehovah. Revelation 13:18, we're told to calculate the number of the beast because it's the number of a man, 666. Lots of stuff has been written on that. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 and 18, Jesus made very clear to the religious leaders and the scribes and so forth, he says, "I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." In fact, not the smallest letter or any little pen stroke, a jot or a tittle in terms of how things are written, none of it will pass away until all of it has been fulfilled. And many of the rabbis point to the fact that Messiah is not only going to interpret the letters and these pen strokes, he's going to interpret the spaces between the letters. Interesting. Daniel chapter 12, Daniel says, "Conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time," or the end times, which we're in now, because many are going to go back and forth on it, but later on, knowledge will in fact increase. And we are now in a case where we can look back with great hindsight, and we have kind of additional knowledge on how to read on Daniel with regard to things about his prophecies on Messiah and so forth. And then Isaiah 29:11 says, "The entire vision will be like words of a sealed book, which when they give it over to one who is literate, saying, 'Oh, please read this,' even the literate person will reply and say, 'I cannot, because it's sealed.'" And the term there for sealed is it's a mystery. It's a code. There's a need for a primer in order to be able to interpret what's going on there. So a lot of the old-time rabbis really understood that the Scripture had embedded in it the fingerprint of God and that there would be codes within. Now, I'm borrowing this slide from a presentation, a series I did back in 2016, 7 years ago, on end times biblical prophecy. And this is one of my favorite ones to show as a macro code. Here are the 10 patriarchs from Genesis, starting with Adam going down to Noah. And you see Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, etc. Enoch, number 7, Methuselah, and then Lamech and Noah. And if you go to newtonfio.com and you click at the top videos, the whole series from 2016 is there, and you can actually watch all the details on many of these Bible prophecies that were covered in that series. But it's interesting that researchers have done quite a bit of work on the root words in Hebrew for the name Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, etc. And Adam's name simply means man. Seth has been appointed. Enosh, mortal or miserable. Kenan has to do with sorrow. Mahela, El, is the blessed God, El. Jared is he shall come down. Enoch is he's teaching or commencing or speaking. Methuselah is his death shall bring. There'll be a Selah, a break, because when he dies, that's the beginning of the flood. Lamech is the despairing. And Noah has always meant comfort or rest. And interestingly, the entire gospel message is outlined there in a macro code, Because when you read Adam through Noah in Hebrew, you don't catch that it's actually saying man has been appointed mortal sorrow. But the blessed God will come down teaching, his death shall bring the despairing comfort and rest. And Enoch becomes a type of the harpazo, or the rapture, because he was taken before the judgment. The prophecy from Jude chapter 4, verse 14 and 15 say, behold, the Lord comes with his myriads of his holy ones. This is what Enoch was preaching right before the flood. And then, of course, Noah becomes a type of Israel because he's not taken out before the judgment, but he's protected and preserved and goes through the judgment. And again, an amazing macro code. You can get more of that again if you look at that series on end times prophecy. Let's close out here with the Masoretic Hebrew Torah in a microcode. I'll give you one example of one. Here's the term Torah in the Hebrew. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, the Hebrew term is Bereshit, simply meaning in the beginning. And if you go and take the last letter, which is a tav, that then becomes, as soon as you find a tav, you start with that one, that becomes the first letter of the word Torah. And if you then count 7 times 7, 7 is the number of perfection for the Lord, 7 times that, 49 letters out, the rabbis went out, 49 letters. The next letter, the 50th letter, turned out to be a vav, which happens to be the second letter in the word Torah. They then went 49 letters out, and then they counted the 50th letter, and it was a resh. And the resh happens to be the third letter in the word Torah. And they counted out again, 7 times 7, 49 letters out. The 50th letter was a hey, and it's the fourth letter of the word Torah. So starting with the beginning of the text, finding the first T, or tav, and then going out 50 letters each spacing there, you spell Torah, heading in toward Exodus. So they went into the book of Exodus. They found the first time the letter tav appears, counted out 50, and they found that when they did this in counting out each time, you would get to the next letter would be a vav. Count out 50 letters, it'd be a resh. Count out 50 letters, it'd be a hey. And it spells Torah again. So you've got Genesis going this way, saying Torah. Exodus going this way, saying Torah. But you come to Leviticus, nothing's there. You come to Numbers, the fourth book. Couldn't find anything going that way. But if you start at the end of Numbers and find the first tav, that T, and then count in the reverse order, coming back toward the beginning of the book, you go 50 letters, 50 letters, 50 letters, and you get tav, vav, resh, and hey, and it spells Torah coming in. And then they went ahead and said, well, let's do it with Deuteronomy as well, the last book of the Torah. And they went out, found the last tav in that, and then came 50 letters in. It's vav, resh, and hey, 50 letters, equidistant spacing. So you had Torah coming in Genesis and Exodus, pointing this way. From Deuteronomy and Numbers, you had Torah coming this way. Say, well, what about Leviticus? And the book that's in the middle of the Torah, they found the first yod, and every seventh letter after the first yod that showed up was yod, hey, vav, hey, which is YHWH, or Yehovah, or Yahweh. And every seventh letter, again, the completeness of the number of God. And so what you end up with is, from Genesis and Exodus, you have Torah going in toward the center. From Deuteronomy and Numbers, you have Torah coming in from the other direction, and right in the center, you end up with Yahweh, or Jehovah. And people say, what's the likelihood that this is by accident? And this is an example of one of these micro Bible codes. So I encourage you, if you get a book, you can read some more on this and find out the details. It's really fascinating. So what are our takeaways from this 2 sessions that we've done, especially tonight, as we've, again, looked some more at the veracity of the Scriptures? Well, the Bible has a huge trove of manuscript evidence, probably the most well-documented book ever on the planet. We have more historical documents. When you keep looking at those from different time periods, they all concur with one another, they all overlap, they all have the same message, the substantive content has not changed at all. The Bible manuscripts confirm all the way across different time periods. So think about it, you have 40 different writers writing 66 different books, starting about, 2 millennia before the time of Christ, going out about 100 years after the time of Christ, so about a 1600-year window. And these writers have ended up with a very, very cogent, well-coordinated, well-confirmed, overlapping, consistent measure of this particular kind of message that they're preaching. And the question is, how could that possibly be? The Bible manuscripts demonstrate incredible consistency. You find a section of the Proverbs or something from the Torah or one of the Gospels, and depending on the time, whether it's from the 3rd, 4th century A.D., maybe it's coming out to the 6th, 7th century, maybe it's one of these early manuscripts in about 1,000 years ago. Compare it to some of the early fragments of the Gospel of John, and you come to see that they're all consistent, which lends credibility to the idea that they did what? They copied consistently as they made different copies and circulated them. The message, the content was the same. Archaeology. We didn't have time in a 2-hour overview as part of a larger program on apologetics, because we have so many other apologetics topics to cover, but it provides excellent confirmation of the Bible events. You can get some great books on Bible archaeology. Things off the top of my head that always are fascinating to me is the group that did a 30-year study on the dig at Tel Jericho, and they took a look at how things were done, and they found the original wall, and the evidence that the walls of that city were not pushed in as if they had been sieged by an outside force, but the walls they have actually fallen out from the inside. And you think about that and the consistency that has with the message of the story of Joshua and so forth coming into the land. Think about the finding of the stone there in Caesarea Maritima that says Pontius Pilate on it. Think about the ossuary where the bones are kept, and the very famous one that came out saying James, the brother of John, of Jesus, and so forth. So when you look at these, take a look. There's lots and lots of Bible archaeology. We just didn't have time in 2 evenings to cover a lot on there. But we did look at some Bible prophecy, not only some Old Testament prophecies within that context that came true and were exact, but more importantly, just the prophecies regarding Jesus Christ, and the overwhelming number of them, time and time again, consistently coming to be exactly as they were prophesied. And as I looked at that one sheet, you can look at the notes on my website, the chance of one man fulfilling all that is one chance in 10 to the 37th power. And that's only about 25, 26, 27 prophecies. You start thinking about over 220 Old Testament prophecies. It's pretty mind-boggling. Then there are Bible codes we looked at, macro and micro codes, and all of these have been tested by many mathematicians, and they're way beyond any potential random accident that these could come out in that kind of a format. And so what's our logical segue here at this stage in our study on apologetics? Well, we've looked at Christian worldview in session 1, and then we took a look at how that segued into 2 sessions on origins. First, the origins of the universe, galaxies, solar system, and Earth. And then we segued into the origins of life. And we spent a lot of time just looking at life on the planet, DNA, and so forth. You can look at that. Amazing support for design and a creator. So the next logical question was then, well, if there's a creator, how could he communicate with us? And we said we could do it generally, because everything that is seen, as I read from Romans chapter 1, is testifying as a witness to his creation, to his being the creator. But he could also testify specifically through a medium that he would deliver, so to speak. And the question we've raised in the last 2 weeks has been, could the Bible be that medium? Could it be the message system by which the creator designer is going to communicate information about himself to mankind? And so last week and this week we took a good look at a lot of evidence to lend credibility that the Bible is not myth, it's not fiction, it didn't just happen, it's very well documented. And if we start to dig into it, what kinds of things can we draw from it? So our segue from session 4 and 5, tonight's session 5, next Monday night, July 17th, session 6 is going to take a look then at absolute truth versus relative truth. And the big question always comes down to, how can we know the difference between absolute truth and relative truth? Is there any basis for establishing and defining absolutes? Where do they come from? How do we understand that? One of the things we'll start off with in one of our topics is we're going to take a look at the founding of Harvard College and how their crest and symbol, even to this day, has always been veritas in the Latin, truth. And the idea is that, you think in verdad in Spanish or vérité en français, and so veritas, truth. The whole mission of Harvard College was to pursue truth. And we'll have some excerpts from their freshman handbook from the 1600s that talked about how reading the Bible and prayer fit perfectly within a typical week of studying at Harvard as you were looking to understand more truth, philosophy, science, etc. And so we're going to take a look at some bases for truth, and can the Bible actually be a resource and a place to go to for solid truth? And this term relative truth, I actually am going to mention when we get together next time that relative truth is actually an oxymoron, because if it's truth, it's not relative to a time or a culture. It's always true. Once again, a quick review of taking a look at the books that I would recommend. These are ones that I have in my collection. These are ones I've read. I think you'll really like Steve Davis's book, The Debate About the Bible. And then I think you'll also like, more recently, the updated version they did using F.F. Bruce, J.I. Packer, Phil Comfort, and Carl Henry, The Origin of the Bible. It's about 20 years it's been out. Now you can get a used paperback copy for $12, $10, something like that. And then one of the ones I also like to point you toward is Norman Geisler's book on inerrancy, and then certainly John MacArthur's book that came out during COVID with a foreword by R.C. Sproul called The Inerrant Word. And John does an exceptional job as the editor, bringing in lots and lots of really solid conservative theologians to make a great case for the inerrancy of the Scripture. And so next week, July 17th, we'll be back here, 6:30, and we're going to take a look at this topic. The following week is going to take a look at, after we look at absolute truth and relative truth, on the 24th, 2 weeks later, we're going to then take a look at, was there really a historic Jesus from Nazareth in the 1st century A.D.? Did the Romans execute him on a cross? And specifically, what about the story of him being resurrected? So for next week, as I mentioned, I'll go back here, we'll be taking a look next time at absolute truth versus relative truth. And then our topic following that on the 17th, the following week, the 24th, we'll take a look at the historic figure of Jesus. Is he a real historic figure? Is he a myth? And what is the evidence pertaining to who Jesus Christ is and was? So that's what we'll be doing in 2 weeks. So I'll look for you next week on July 17th as we look at absolute truth and relative truth. So let me pray for us. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we've had together. I pray you'd bless the time that we have in your word. I pray that each person, as we go into these topics on apologetics, you would guide us, direct us, show us the evidence, help us to recognize that there are some great resources out there so that we may be good responders who are thoughtful, logical, rational, and that we have good bases for our responses to the skeptics. So thank you for this time, a blessing on each person, and we look forward to getting together next time to take a look at absolute truth and relative truth. We pray this in your name. Amen. Good night.